There we- Good afternoon and welcome to the latest lecture of the World War II Discussion Forum. I'm thrilled to have our author today, Tom Whipple, The Battle of the Beams. It's a fascinating and really fantastic story. We're going to go ahead and get started in about 1 minute. I see a number of people are still logging into Zoom. In the meantime, I'm going to put a link to our speaker's book in the chat for everyone. So we'll get started in about 1 minute. Thank you. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Greg McNiff. I'm the Executive Director and founder of the World War II Discussion Forum. Before I introduce this afternoon's speaker, I want to briefly cover the usual housekeeping items. First, our speaker has graciously agreed to take some questions after his prepared remarks. You have two ways to ask a question. You can either use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and I will read out your question to our speaker. Or if you prefer to ask your question directly, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen, and I will call on you to unmute your line. Regardless, please be respectful of our speaker and the audience when asking your question. We'll take about 15 or so minutes of questions and go to about 2 p.m. New York time. So the total event would last about an hour. Second, donations are always appreciated but never expected. There is a donate tab on the website. Third and finally, you can send any feedback through the website at wwiidf.org. And I should add, fourth and finally, I'm recording this talk in an attempt to upload it to a YouTube channel at some point in the future. Now to this afternoon's speaker. Tom Whipple is the science editor at The Times. He covers everything from archaeology to zoology. He writes news, features, reviews, and commentary across the paper, as well as appearing regularly on Times Radio. He joined the paper in 2006, shortly after graduating with a degree in mathematics. During the course of his job, he has visited the tunnels below CERN and the top of Mount Blanc above it. He has seen the inside of the world's hottest sauna and the world's most irradiated nature reserve. He's interviewed Stephen Hawking, and he has been arrested in 3 different countries. As well as The Times, he has written for The Guardian and The Economist. He was named Science Journalist of the Year for his coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic. This afternoon, he's going to speak about his book, The Battle of the Beams, The Secret Science of Radar That Turned the Tide of the Second World War, which examines how British scientist R.V. Jones worked to counter the German Luftwaffe's use of radio beams for guiding bombers to their target. I really enjoyed the story. I enjoyed the science of it, as well as the characters, and Tom knows it very well. Not surprisingly, the reviews have been great. Roland White, author of Mosquito, writes full of memorable characters and written with all the drama and pace of a Robert Harris thriller, while the Mail also writes deeply researched with the pace of a well-crafted thriller. I'm thrilled to have Tom with us today, and with that, Tom, I'll turn it over to you.
Hello and good afternoon, and thank you very much for such a lovely introduction. And thank you all for coming on in the middle of the day in New York. It's the evening in the UK, which is a more usual time for a talk. I have, as you heard, I've written a book about the radio war, and this book, it's inspired by 2 people and 2 stories. Those are the 2 people. The first concerns the young radio scientist Mary Moore, who's obviously the one on the right. In early June 1944, she was moving from ship to ship along the south coast of England. Before the Normandy invasion, select vessels had been given a new piece of radio positioning equipment. And at each ship, Mary, who had been sent by the Admiralty, the British sort of naval research group, would embark and explain how it worked. At the back of her mind, though, was a worry. Those early June days were also a countdown, and although the end date was unknown to most people, so at some point, to use the phrase of the day, the balloon would go up, D-Day would be on, and no one, whether sailors, soldiers, or female mathematicians would be able to leave the ships. If it happened while she was on board, she would be on her way to Normandy. Apparently, in the story I heard, she got off the ship just in time. Here's the other story, as I heard it. Along the coast at Portland, Raymond Whipple, another Admiralty radio scientist, was also inspecting the fleet. Puffing on his pipe, he was the picture of an absent-minded professor. Earlier in the war, he'd been given a captured German radio-controlled torpedo to play with and had a lovely time and managed to lose it. And he was having a lovely time that June day too. Although he had a view of the greatest invasion force in history, he had been distracted by a cloud formation, and to the delight of the sailors, he walked right off the pier and into the sea. Now, in case you haven't guessed it, those two were my grandparents, and they were, as I have discovered, so many people's grandparents were radio scientists in the war. We're familiar with things like the Manhattan Project or the British code breakers at Bletchley Park. And I suppose the thesis of my book was that there was another scientific war that was just as big, just as significant, but a bit more diffuse. And this was the radio war. In the Second World War, we came to understand these words, air supremacy. But air supremacy also meant airwave supremacy. There were vast numbers of scientists on both sides of the channel battling for control of the electromagnetic spectrum. And this isn't just about radar. So at the start of the war, the sky was quite a lonely place. A British bomber aimed by sight, and it navigated using techniques that would have been recognised by participants at the Battle of Trafalgar. By the end of the war, there were navigation systems that had changed this completely. You could direct a lone bomber to a single factory in the Ruhr and leave it in rubble, having not even seen it, having dropped its bombs through cloud. But there were German anti-aircraft guns who could spot the bomber through that cloud and shoot back. And there were night fighters that could spot all of these radio waves bouncing around and lock onto the bomber that sent them. We don't talk about this quite so much. Part of the reason, I think, is because there wasn't one place, one figure, one research institution. There wasn't an Oppenheimer or a Turing. I haven't attempted to tell the whole tale of this in my book. I haven't even really told the tale of my grandparents at all. Those two stories that I have are the only stories I know of them in the war. And to be perfectly honest, I think they're anecdotes whose truth has been adapted to suit the consumer's needs, and the rough edges have been knocked off them to make a better tale. For my talk, I'm certainly not going to cover it all. I've taken inspiration from there was this thing that was quite popular in the UK. It may not have made it to the US. It was a British Museum podcast called A History of the World in 100 Objects. It just took one object, one place, and tried to talk about it. And that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to start in one place, and it's the laboratory of a man called Harry Grindle Matthews, sometime in the early 1920s. And Mr. Matthews on this particular day is killing a mouse with a death ray. Sorry, it's 6 p.m. in the UK, so I'm allowed a beer. So he writes in this magazine article about it, the projection of energy through space without the use of wires or mechanical contrivances has long been a dream of scientists. And now he said he had achieved it. And he had tested it. In his laboratory, he had concentrated the energy of an electromagnetic beam onto an engine and stopped it. As the ray touched, the roar of the exhaust died quickly into complete silence, he wrote. Then he directed it at gunpowder in a metal container, which ignited it. This may later, he said, be employed to blow up battleships. Finally, he'd turned its destructive power on the mouse. As this beam of light crept up and finally struck full upon the little animal, he reacted exactly as he would have done to the shock of a wire grounding through him. He was killed very quickly. He could have been killed instantly, except for the danger of creating fire by applying the full force of the ray. So back in those days, everybody was looking for death rays. Electromagnetism was young. The realization that there was light, because that's all this is, it's light, but light beyond the visible. This was new. And somewhere in this spectrum, everyone was convinced lay a super weapon. Now, as you can see, and this is the, it's the new death-dealing diabolical rays. It wasn't even so interesting they got it. This did not make the cover of Popular Radio Monthly, which determined that the creation of a death ray was less interesting than how to build a two-tube reflex receiver. It's because in all of the major powers throughout the 20s and 30s, there were attempts to harness the electromagnetic spectrum to create rays of varying diabolical nature. Proposals included beams to boil the insides of enemy soldiers, beams to immobilize tanks, beams to explode bombs while they're still held in the undercarriage of attacking bombers. Such was the profusion of claims that in Britain, the Air Ministry offered a £1,000 prize for any inventor who could, quote, demonstrate the killing of a sheep at a range of 100 yards, the secret to remain with the owner. The sheep waited for their fate and waited and waited. Grindle Matthews oddly always had a reason why the time wasn't right, whether for sheep bothering or more straightforwardly rodenticide. With a dearth of willing inventors, the Air Ministry asked the opinion of its scientists. Why were the sheep of Britain not even so much as gently warmed? The radio scientist Robert Watson Watt, when forced to give his view, explained that regretfully he considered it an unlikely path of fruitful research. For one thing, he said, radio is not a good way of transferring energy. Using a walkie-talkie does not boil your brain, and you hold it right next to your head. It was also easy enough to do the calculation that the amount of power required to raise a large animal's temperature by a degree, let alone boil it, was prohibitive. The sheep were safe. And yet, Watson Watt was not wholly dismissive. In his concluding reply, he suggested there might well be a super weapon, just not of the kind they were thinking. Attention is being turned to the still difficult but less unpromising problem of radio detection, he wrote. Numerical considerations on the method of detection by reflected radio waves will be submitted when required. In other words, maybe they should ask him about something more sensible than sheep killing, and they might learn something useful. Eventually, they did. The next place, and Robert Watson Watt is known in the UK as the father of radar. The next place I want to take you to is a hotel room in Oslo, on a gloomy night in 1939. Norway had still not been invaded. And here, this German businessman made a request of the head porter. Would it be possible, he asked, to borrow a typewriter? This man is Hans Ferdinand Mayer, and he was a middle-aged man with neat swept-back hair and a neat suit, and the sort of boringly technical job that rarely invited further questions. As he took the machine up to his room on that cold Norwegian night, it seems unlikely that anyone would have looked up from their drinks in the reception of the Hotel Bristol to see this man in a generic suit heading upstairs and realized later that they were witness to arguably the greatest intelligence leak in history. Because he went up to that room and he started typing, and over the course of 2 nights, he started writing down everything that he knew. Mayer was a brilliant scientist who had become part of the German corporate machinery. He had studied under a Nobel laureate and published papers and patents, then risen through the ranks to head the Siemens Research Laboratory. Here, during the 30s, he noticed that his job had changed, subtly at first. Increasingly, the role was not civil but military, and especially, he wrote after the war, he found himself working on new and secret weapons which required communications and electronics techniques. He understood all too well what that meant. This meant, he said, sooner or later, war. And he really didn't like the Nazis. And one of the interesting things about him is he almost didn't like them for intellectual reasons. He found the treatment of the Jews, I mean, I suppose he found it morally abhorrent, but he found it irrational. And he just didn't get it. And this was his response. The report, written on 2 consecutive nights, it reflected all of his knowledge, but also its fragmentary nature. He started with a description of the bomber program. He talked about remote control gliders and missiles. He mentioned rockets. He mentioned these ideas of these rockets that could be sent up and guided by radio to their targets. He had pieces of the information, but not the whole jigsaw. He revealed, for instance, that the Germans had this astonishing kind of radio device which could bounce radio waves off incoming objects to see them. He just said it had already spotted RAF planes from 120 kilometers away. He was telling the RAF that the Germans had radar, not obviously that they wanted to hear it. Another paragraph spoke of navigation, describing in detail a radio system that could tell a bomber how far it had traveled towards its target, providing precise information that could be used for pinpoint bombing. It suggested that the Germans had expertise in controlling radio waves, which was far more advanced than Britain had thought. So, what did Whitehall make when this was delivered anonymously to the Norwegian embassy? Well, not much. How, they asked themselves, could one man possibly have all this information? They decided that this supposed leak was designed to deceive, to have them fighting shadows. One official report later ruefully put it, according to the logic of the time, it was planted by a wily enemy who made sure that the few checkable facts were true so that Britain would foolishly believe all the rest. On this basis, everyone ignored it, except for one young intelligence officer. Later, this officer said that he came to treat it like a guide to the future. In the few dull moments of the war, I used to look at the Oslo report to see what would be coming along next, he wrote. That man was Reginald Jones. And that takes us to our third location, a meeting of the War Cabinet in Downing Street on the 21st of June, 1940. Now, Reginald Jones had, as every day, turned up to the office late. His title was Assistant Director of Intelligence Science. It was a very grand title, but he assisted no one and directed no one. His was a department of one. His job was precisely what he made of it. It was an experiment. In an unusual move, the intelligence service had decided that it needed to not just employ classicists. So it was sort of it was going to take a punt on a physicist. And he was brought in. And his job was to imagine what was going on in the minds of the German scientists and preempt it. When offered the job, he said, a man in this position could lose the war. I'll take it. And here is a typical report from monthly summaries 3 and 4. You don't have to worry too much about what it says, but it's very typical of his output in those early weeks. There are 30 carefully bullet-pointed descriptions of Axis technologies. There's aerial mines in Italy. There's night camouflage for planes, stupefying gas, Molotov's bread baskets. What I really like about this, reading this in sort of the British National Archives, is you get to read all these asides. He ends it by apologising that the previous month he had produced no such document. He says, it's regretted that no separate summary could be issued owing to the preoccupation of the entire staff of this branch with a specific problem. The entire staff in question was, of course, just him. And that specific problem was the reason this morning, when he arrived in late, he found he'd been summoned to Downing Street, which is the seat of the UK government. He burst into the room after the meeting had started, and he arrived to see there was a vigorous argument going on. And the subject of the argument was German navigation beams. It's worth saying at this point that he was 28, and this room was full of the most senior people in the British war effort. Now, at the start of the war, Britain had an idea. It had this idea that Britain alone had, through scientific pluck and ingenuity, developed radar to spot enemy planes. But as I said, when our planes flew over Germany, they navigated by the stars, and that seemed to make perfect sense. We were a seafaring nation. We were the heirs to Nelson. We were damn it, we were British, and we knew how to navigate. It turned out later in the war we didn't at all, and almost all of that early bombing effort was completely pointless. But we didn't know that. There have been hints from downed enemy aircraft, from agents, from intelligence intercepts that the Germans had a different method, that they used beams instead to guide their planes to the target, that they had the first precision bombing apparatus. Some thought this nonsense, impossible, and Jones stood there watching them argue. At last, Winston Churchill turned to address a technical question to Jones. And what I love about this meeting is Jones, I should say, can't be wholly relied upon. He's a guy a bit like Richard Feynman, who he loved a story, and he was very arrogant, and annoyingly the arrogance was justified. But in this case, we can get the meeting from two perspectives. We can get it from Hibbs, and we can get it from Churchill writing after the war. And what Churchill wrote was, "Would it help, sir," the young man replied, "if I told you the story from the start?" And Churchill described the moment. He said, "For 20 minutes or more, he spoke in quiet tones, unrolling the chain of circumstantial evidence, the like of which, for its convincing fascination, was never surpassed by tales of Sherlock Holmes." This is how the system works. So it was, Jones claimed, based on something called the Lorentz blind landing system, which everyone would have understood at the time in the RAF and the US Air Force. This is what you're looking at is a schematic of it. Now, imagine I got you to follow a torch beam or a flashlight beam. I'm talking to Americans, a flashlight beam. Now, I could direct you 100 meters and you'd go to where the beam was pointing. But of course, the beam would spread out. And eventually it'd be so spread out that there'd be nothing to follow. The arc would be massive. But imagine if I had two torch beams and I just got them to graze each other. I got them to intersect. And I said, follow the intersection of the beams. Well, then you could get it a lot narrower. And that's the idea here. If you look at this diagram, there's the light beam, radio again is light, and the one at the top is sending out dots. So it goes dot, 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 dot. The one at the bottom is sending out dashes. It goes dash, dash, dash. If you're in the dots, you know you've got to turn right. If you're in the dashes, you know you've got to turn left. And if you're where the two meet, well, you get the intersection and the dots precisely join with the dashes. You get a continuous note and it just goes deep. So then you know you're where you are. And what the Germans had done was found a way to make this tight enough so that it didn't just guide people into the runway. It projected out over Britain. And it projected out over the target. And so Jones explained this, and he explained why he thought, and the doubters were not necessarily won over, but they weren't any longer relevant. Jones had spoken above the heads of the, as I said, the most senior people in the country to make an ally of the only person who mattered. Church wrote, "Being master and not having to argue too much, once I was convinced about the principles of this queer and deadly game, I gave all the necessary orders that very day for the existence of the beam to be assumed and for all countermeasures to receive absolute priority." So the next night, planes were sent up. This is the plane that went up to look for radio signals with Lorentz characteristics. And just south of a place called Spalding, they picked up some faint dots. As the plane shuddered onwards, they heard a continuous note lasting a few seconds. Then just a little bit further, it went back to dashes. The plane continued and flew into silence and then came across dashes and then a continuous note and then dots. The continuous note was about 400 yards wide. It had crossed an electromagnetic road in the sky. And actually, we knew there were intelligence intercepts of where these should have been being projected from. And so we had two dots on the lines and two dots to find a line. And you got two lines. And they had painted an electromagnetic cross. They had painted X marks the spot. And the spot that they had put the cross over was Derby. It was the Rolls-Royce engine factory that made all of the engines for British fighters, and that was the target. And so they started the countermeasures, and they started the countermeasures almost before the first bombs had been dropped using this program. Our fourth location is Chesil Beach. So there was a film, there's a film about Chesil Beach. It's called On Chesil Beach. It is nothing, alas, to do. It's about romance. Absolutely nothing to do with more important things like radio war. But I like it, and I'll get to the reason why I like it in a bit. But we're here in early November 1940 at the site of a crashed Heinkel 111. So the Knickerbein beam, which is what that first one had been called, was largely thwarted. But another had emerged. The Germans did things in duplicate, actually. Actually, it turns out they did things in triplicate when it came to beams. This one was more sophisticated. You didn't have to listen to the note. You got electronic equipment to listen to it. There were actually a lot more beams involved. It was far more sophisticated and far harder to jam. It was called excavate. And in a week's time, this was going to be used on a raid on a town in the Midlands of England. It was a raid called Operation Moonlight Sonata, and all of this was known to British military intelligence. What they didn't know yet was the target of the raid, but what they also didn't know was the full technical specifications of excavate. But all of those technical specifications lay on this crashed Heinkel 111 on Chesil Beach. It was a member of an elite pathfinding squad, and slightly embarrassingly for a member of an elite pathfinding squad, it had got lost. And somewhere over southern Britain, it had run out of fuel, and it was looking for somewhere to crash land. And the thing about Chesil Beach is this is a really long spit of land. It's got a lagoon one side, and from above, I mean, it's 10 kilometers long and it's completely straight. From above, it would have looked exactly like a runway. It would have looked perfect. It's an awful place to land on. It's got shingle stones that go sort of 20 foot high. And it was a really messy landing. And they didn't have time to destroy the excavate equipment. This was a gift for British military intelligence. But there was a problem. It had come to rest in the surf. And this is where, as a non-fiction writer, you can write stuff because it's true, but as a fiction writer, you just couldn't write it because people would say you're being ridiculous. The army had turned up and they'd seen this plane and they'd said, right, this is ours, we're going to retrieve it. They got to go, they got down to the business of salvaging it. The Navy had turned up and they said, no, you see, its tires are wet. It's in the sea. This is a Navy matter. We want it. This standoff continued. And the sea, which is just no respecter of inter-service rivalries, did what the sea did. And it came in and the tide came in and it lapped over the equipment and it washed it and it submerged the bomber. By a week later, the wreckage, the now soaked wreckage, had still not been inspected. The target was known. It was Coventry. The jammers were in place, but they needed to be set. And Jones didn't know the settings. He wrote afterwards, it was a most diabolical bit of gambling, as you can imagine. He just had to guess them. And he said, if one's wrong, perhaps 500 people are dead in the morning. Then he went to bed. And when he awoke, 500 people were indeed dead. That raid on Coventry is remembered as one of the most devastating during the Blitz in Britain. Probably the bombers would have found it anyway. It was a moonlit night. It wasn't a hard target, but it remains one of the great what ifs. And I remember I put up the Chesil Beach thing. As I say, it's all about romance. It's about a marriage that's gone wrong. But the tagline for it was, this is how the entire course of a life can be changed by doing nothing. And I thought that was rather apposite given this other Chesil Beachy circumstances. Now I'm going to go on. I've got a few more. I think I can go probably to about 1:45 and see if we've got some questions. I'm going to take you to the most dramatic location of all, 1,000 foot up in the middle of the North Sea, with a mad Dane climbing onto the wing of a wrecked biplane to refuel it. This is someone else's book. It is unusual to plug someone else's book during a book talk, but it's a really good book. And it's just about this man, and he deserves it. Thomas Schnorm was not a sensible man at all. When the war began, he was furious that he had not been allowed to fight. He was a pilot, and the Danish king had ordered them to surrender. So he didn't get a chance to commit suicide in a biplane against an ME-109. At one point he hatched a plan to kill Goebbels with a bow and arrow, which was only thwarted when Goebbels didn't turn up. That was not why he was escaping at this particular moment, though. He was escaping because of something he saw. There was still incredibly a debate about radar and whether the Germans had it. This is despite them literally saying that they had it. There were these exchanges that the Luftwaffe and the RAF had pre-war where they'd go to visit each other and have a nice meal and get drunk. And one of these, a German officer got too drunk and he basically said, I paraphrase, but only slightly, ha ha, how are you getting on with your radio bouncing thing that tells you how far away planes are? Ours is really good. This was written down. We by this stage, we got the Oslo report. We captured a German boat which had radar on and identified radar, but still somehow there was an official assumption that there wasn't radar. Anyway, Schnorm had seen it. He and a friend had been snooping around. And creeping through the trees, they'd gone in for a closer look at this odd structure. He listened as a plane flew over and watched as this structure came to life and swiveled to follow it. And then there was a searchlight that was switched on that lit up the Junkers that had gone over. And he said, it was that demonstration which made me certain we were dealing with some kind of early warning system. I was convinced that they now have the capacity to plot the position of a ship using radio waves, which is an amazing deduction. He returned with a movie camera, and he was spotted by the Germans filming it. Well, they didn't film; they spotted him there, and quick thinkingly, he pulled down his trousers and sat on the movie camera. And when the German turned up, he claimed to be defecating and told him to go away, and it worked. But he needed to get the movie out. I'm absolutely certain he did not alight on the most sensible way to get the movie out. What he did was he found a plane. The plane didn't have any wings on it. It was in a farmer's shed. He screwed on the wings. He flew out of the shed. He flew over the radar that was designed to spot planes, and the only reason it didn't spot him, or it might have spotted him, the only reason they couldn't do anything about it was actually this was the night of our Operation Barbarossa, and all the fighters had gone to the Eastern Front. And then he flew over the North Sea, but he didn't have enough fuel, so he had to climb out onto the wing midway through to refuel it. Obviously, when he turned up in Britain, first of all, he was nearly shot down. Then he was nearly shot by the Home Guard, who were delighted to have something to do. And he was obviously completely disbelieved. And he was arrested as a spy. Eventually, one person, Jones, believed him and went to see him. And they took his film and they processed the film of this precious film of the radar, but they processed it by sending it to the post office, which is in Britain that's how we deliver mail, and they screwed it up. And Schnorm was sort of hilarious about this. He said, "I went mad when I realized what had happened. You stupid bastards," I told them. "Do you know how many times I risked my life for those films? They were trying to calm me down, but I just kept going. Are you intelligence officers? What is intelligent about you? Why did you send them to a fucking post office in the first place?" But anyway, there were a couple of frames that came out, and it was enough. It was enough to show that radar existed and the Germans had it. Which takes us to our next place, a field in France at close to midnight on a snowy night in February 1942, and 100 paratroopers have just landed. They are the first Allied troops back in France since Dunkirk. And this is a most dangerous moment, the moment when the mission is at its most fragile, and they are all urinating. This is Operation Biting. It's considered the birth of the parachute regiment. And I love this because you read about this in National Archives and they don't put a gloss on it. They sort of begin by explaining they had all drunk way too much tea on the way over, which meant that almost the first thing written by the parachute regiment in any official correspondence relating to their action that night is a report that begins, "Our first action on landing was to urinate." Luckily, their landing was unopposed. They were here to collect a radar. The decision had been taken that it was time to inspect one. Jones, by this time, did have some staff. To his great annoyance, one of them had volunteered to go on the raid. This was annoying because, said Jones, as soon as he had volunteered, I had also to do so. Luckily, the British High Command isn't quite that mad. They decided to choose a specialist not au fait with full affairs of state. And a guy called Charles Cox put himself forward, was sort of. Cox had been summoned to a meeting with Air Commodore Victor Tate at the Air Ministry, where he said, "You volunteered for a dangerous job, Sergeant Cox." And Cox said, "No, sir." "What do you mean, no, sir?" He said, "I never volunteered for anything, sir." The Commodore acknowledged there might have been some miscommunication, then asked Cox, "Well, will you volunteer now?" Cox not unreasonably asked for details of the mission that was so dangerous that on hearing about it, Commodore felt the need to meet him in person. The Commodore said, "I'm not at all at liberty to tell you," but said, "I honestly think the job offers a reasonable chance of survival." Anyway, there they all were, weeing in a field. It was a combined operation, and the reason they're doing it is because of this. This is considered one of the classic air reconnaissance photos taken during the war. It was taken of one sort of German radar, which you can't see in this particular shot. But when they took it, they saw a path coming out, and then a path that went around something and then continued. And they thought, what's it going around? So they went in for an oblique shot like this. And what you're seeing is an almost perfect radar dish. And this is their second kind of radar. And this is one that had a general early warning radar. But then this one, called a Würzburg, was used to lock onto the target and guide night fighters directly to the bomber. And they wanted it. Again, I love reading about this in the archives. They describe storming this villa that you can see, and they were aware that this was going to be read by Churchill himself, and so they said, we ran upstairs shouting surrender and Hande hoch in German, and they said the coyness of this. We also used very bad language. Anyway, they took it, and then they went to take the radar itself, and it was a hugely dramatic raid, and it was also almost entirely bloodless from the point of view of the Brits. And what I find astonishing about it is, so they got the radar, and then they went down to the beach, and they were picked up by the Royal Navy, who'd prepared for this, and they took one prisoner. And it's fascinating reading about the prisoner, because you have to read between the lines, and it seems like he's created this figure of fun, this guy they found dangling off the cliff having run away, and isn't it comical? Actually, I think what happened probably was there was a bit of a massacre, and there was quite a lot of Germans who were executed here, and then this particular prisoner was beaten up until he told them where the reinforcements were coming from. But all of this comes out obliquely, and understandably obliquely, and I don't judge at all. They were there behind enemy lines. But from the point of view of the British, fewer people died. There was a higher success rate in terms of fatalities than every night in the bomber raids that are going on at the moment, where every night in the bomber raids, 1 in 20 bombers didn't return. The intelligence they gained was crucial, and it was enough to finally put the final pieces into the German early warning system and understand how their radar works, and then how to counter it. Which brings us to our final location, for which I think I've just about got time. And our final location is the south coast of England, June the 5th, 1944, where a great flotilla was amassing, but it's not the one you're thinking of. It's not this one. Churchill famously said that the truth is so precious that it must be protected by a bodyguard of lies. This fleet was the final bodyguard. Over the preceding months, there have been attacks designed to remove almost all the radar defenses from Norway to Spain. Almost all, because they wanted one set left to see this particular invasion fleet and its invasion of Calais. It was a few ramshackle boats. They were carrying barrage balloons designed to look like the reflection of very big boats. On board, they had one of the many radio countermeasures devices that had been designed over this period. It was something called Moonshine. And when it was pinged by radar, it sent back a really big ping back, again, to look like there was a lot going on here. Above, there was a squadron of bombers who'd been training for months to fly in circles that slowly processed forwards over this at the speed of the flotilla. And they were dropping something that was called at the time window. We know it better as chaff. Just big radio reflectors, which again were just there to make it look like there was something big. And then it very slowly reached its target. It moored off the coast, it weighed anchor, and they played the sounds of a fleet weighing anchor. This represented what had been going on. Because this wasn't just what was going on. Above, planes were flying. They had all sorts of jamming devices. They flew the width of France with these jamming devices that effectively cut France in two electromagnetically. Because what had happened was there'd been an evolutionary arms race, sort of like the undersea soundscape, where each click and whistle, each burst of sonar and fish evading the sonar is part of this furious competition. There was a great profusion of countermeasures. The Allies had grocer and airborne grocer, cigar, jostle, pipe rack, bag full blonde and boozer. The Germans had Barbara and Barbarossa, Bernhard and Bernardine, Taunus and Berlin. Each of these fought for supremacy in its own band of the electromagnetic spectrum, and if each bought as much as 6-week advantage before it was counted, it was enough. I'm sure something very similar is going on now in the electromagnetic warfare in Ukraine. For Jones, the most fun came when the British got their own German-speaking radio controllers involved. From transmitters in the UK, they began sending their own orders to the Luftwaffe pilots in German. In one exchange they recorded, it just descended into farce, two controllers both insisting they were German. "Don't be led astray by the enemy," warned the German. "In the name of General Schmidt, I order all the aircraft to Kassel." And then he swore, which provided the RAF operator with the opportunity to say, "The Englishman is now swearing." And then the German said, "It's not the Englishman who's swearing, I'm swearing." It sort of went on in desperation. The Luftwaffe switched to using only female controllers. But then, as General Schmidt said after the war, the use of women's voices proved to be futile, as the enemy had the very same at his disposal. After the war, what I found interesting about this is how did they not spot that this fleet was nonsense? And in fact, that would have said that there definitely wasn't an invasion in Calais. Coburn, who was one of the guys who'd masterminded all of this, he said one should imagine, it's more about psychology. Try to imagine the scene. A frightened and undertrained young conscript radio operator sees this ghost fleet and reports it to his headquarters as a long-expected enemy invasion force. And so do his colleagues at radars on either side. And soon the plot becomes a broad arrow on a map in headquarters. And once something's a broad arrow on a map in headquarters, it takes a lot to remove it. It takes a few hours, and a few hours is all they needed. And this, I think, became the apotheosis of what the radio war was about and the deception, and shows the absolute crucialness of it. And I'll leave you with the thoughts of Hermann Goering, who, I think, he had his flaws, but he's not often remembered for his comedy stylings. And he said, exasperately of the Allies, "In the field of the war radar, they must have the world's greatest geniuses. They have the geniuses and we have the nincompoops," which is an amazing quote, and I think actually deeply unfair, because the Germans were just as good at this stuff. But anyway, I'll leave it there and see if there's any questions.
Hey Tom, that was very informative and entertaining. I'm guessing this isn't your first presentation. Thank you very much for that. We have a few. Mike, I'm going to read one in the queue and then I'll go to you. From Charles: when did the British government know that their radar system to protect England from air attack worked? I heard that England was not going to war until it knew it could defend itself from air attack. Is September 3rd, 1939 that date? This is a multi-part question. Also,
Yeah.
English keep radar such a secret that they did not, I guess, share it with the U.S. on how to use, and thus radar didn't help with Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941.
On the first, I mean, I think we had war thrust upon us in the UK. We were very aware there was this doctrine of the bomber always gets through, which was throughout the 30s, and we were very aware of our vulnerability. And I think maybe even too scared of the bombers. We certainly bought time. I mean, there's a school of thought that the Munich agreement, this sort of fateful, ill-advised agreement to make the pact with Hitler, actually allowed Britain enough time to just about cling on. I think by that stage war was inevitable, and we were just lucky that Chain Home, which was the name for our radar, was in place by then. And of course, you've got to remember that we had sort of 6 months or more after that before the war proper began. In terms of sharing secrets with the US, the thing about, as I said, the thing about the radar is everyone thought they were developing it. I'm pretty certain that the US was developing it at the same time, although obviously not with remotely the same urgency. We did share secrets later on. There was a thing called the cavity magnetron. Which was this amazing device which amplified. The Germans never did anything like it, and it allowed airborne radar because it allowed for miniaturization and really high power. And basically, we turned when we were absolutely desperate for the Americans to join the war. There was this thing called the Tizard mission, where Henry Tizard, who is one of our great scientists, essentially turned up like some sort of vassal state bearing gifts and carrying the cavity magnetron on the sort of the metaphorical pillow to present. So eventually, certainly, we did go quite in for sharing our crown jewels and our secrets. But my honest answer is I don't know whether it could have got in there for Pearl Harbor. It feels strange to me that given everything that had gone on by then, that the Americans wouldn't have been aware of radar by Pearl Harbor because, you know, it was quite obvious what was going on. That was sort of, 2 years in, and it was so crucial. So I suspect they knew, but I can't speak with authority on that.
I'll just take one more. There's a question on, was there any type of relationship with Bletchley Park and Alan Turing? I think, Tom, you may reference Turing helping Enigma, cracking Enigma.
Yeah, actually, Jones was one of the few people who had pretty much direct access. So in the, throughout the periods when they were and weren't breaking it, he was receiving the stuff from Bletchley Park. He got a lot from the resistance as well. He loved the Belgian resistance. That they provided a lot of detail. It's quite hard. You have to, when you go through the archives, you have to be able to decode yourself because Bletchley Park was considered so secret that it's not even written down. So they will say there's these sort of forms of codes where they'll say, "Oh, we received a report from so and so," and you have to realize what they're actually saying is, "We got this from the Enigma," but they weren't even prepared to write it in the top secret documents.
Great, Mike, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. It's two questions. One, during the Dieppe raid in 1942, there was a RAF Sergeant Jack Nissenthal whose job was to try to, well, he claimed it had to do with the cavity magnetron and trying to get into the Freya radar system. And I was wondering if that, in other words, what that had to do, if that helped or had anything to do with the excuse me, intelligence concerning the German radar systems, how it was used, and whether or not it was used, this intelligence was used primarily for the bomber raids over occupied Europe and Germany, or if any of it was held, any of the information they got was held until the time approaching D-Day and used exclusively to spoof the German radar systems for D-Day. And the second question would be, how accurate were the radar systems employed in the bombers, such as Ace-2X, which are of course bombing at night, in comparison with the USAAF use of the Norden bomb sight? Sorry, those are two totally unrelated.
No, that's fine. I can't give you the specifics on the latter. You referring to sort of the idea of the radar bombing that was used versus
Yeah.
the Norden bomb site. I mean, radar bombing wasn't particularly accurate. I mean, it was, it was the same. It was never going to be better than visual bombing because all you're getting is a. So for those who don't know, but basically they sort of discovered by chance midway through the war that you were getting these reflections, which were initially really annoying. You got your cavity magnetron in your plane. I was sending out radar ostensibly to see planes, oncoming planes, but you get bounce backs from the ground, and then they began to think, well, actually, this is light. Can we see stuff in the bounce backs from the ground? And then you kind of realize that you can produce a map through the clouds of stuff below you, and so that's what. So in the UK, it was something called H2S that became the radar. The radar navigation thing, but these things really come into their own, I think, as well in the Cold War, where during the 50s, people like General LeMay was planning on launching entire atomic countermeasures using only radar maps of the targets. But those were never going to be as good as the Norden bomb site. But of course, the Norden bomb site, was doing a slightly different thing. On your first question, I slightly missed the beginning. You were talking about the Freya, the knowledge of the Freya. It sounded like a G upgrade you were talking about, or
Well, the idea is that during the DEP raid, they sent Sergeant Jack Nissenthal of the RAF, who was somewhat of an expert, to try to get into the Freya system at Dieppe. And
Dieppe, right?
Yeah, and that I wonder if whatever information he got, because he didn't actually get into the radar station or get the cavity magnetron, but he did manage to blow up the wires and send the information into the air, which might have been processed by Ultra. But I wonder if they were using that in concert with the Würzburg, the information gotten from the Würzburg raid, Frost parachute raid, and if it was used primarily for bomber operations, or was some of it saved or held back to be used exclusively for the invasion?
I see. Yeah. No, they didn't really. I mean, the main reason they didn't hold back that much for the invasion is actually they blew up every radar. I mean, they just went more crudely. They had to blow up pretty much every radar on the coast. Because if they just blew up the ones in Normandy, it might have given away what was going on. Prior to then, they'd done a pretty good job. I mean, the technical information on the Freya and the Würzburg really helped. The countermeasures were pretty crude but effective. So they had ones where they just blasted these things with electromagnetic noise. They had things like moonshine, which again just sent back a really big ping to confuse them. Far and away the most effective countermeasure, which by the end, I mean, it had almost sort of ended it, was, well, there was a mix of the bomber stream where they just said, well, we're just going to go over together, because the Würzburg system meant that they could only ever single out a single bomber at a time. So if you went over one section where there was one Würzburg, and that's what they really learned from it, then you completely overwhelm it, and everyone else would get through. But the thing that blew it all apart was chaff window. They never completely recovered from having just basically strips of tin foil, which I don't think really needed massive technical knowledge of the systems. But yeah, by the end, they used explosives, so the ingenuity had passed.
Thank you, and great talk, by the way. Great.
Cheers.
It's Mike. Craig, if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yeah, hi. Can folks hear me?
Yeah, we can, Craig.
Okay. Great, a wonderful presentation, and great story about your grandparents. Just as an aside, real quick, my maternal grandfather was a trench runner in the Argonne Forest in World War I. And about September 1918, he was grazed in the head by a German sniper.
Wow.
So I'm only here due to the
Wow.
vicissitudes of physics or
That is a
a
chain of
little
fate.
luck. I've often wondered about that sniper, if maybe he had slipped on a rock or was thinking about his Fräulein back home, or maybe had a little too much to drink the night before. But for whatever reason, I'm very thankful that his shot was off by a millimeter or two, which I guess has come to think of it, the same thing that happened to our president. But
Yeah.
I'm very curious. You talked about the Würzburg radar, and first of all, I'm trying to this is obviously not my area. I'm trying to remember what the name of the German early warning system line was. It the Dimrock or something? What was that line called?
Oh God, I wrote the book ages ago. So it's each one they made it out of these blocks where each
Mhm.
block had a Freya and then two Würzburg. One of the Würzburgs was to direct the night fighter, and the other one was to direct. Oh God, this is really annoying me because it was named after one of, I think it was named after one of the generals who was in control,
Yes.
the Kammhuber line, I think he called it.
Comhuber.
That's it.
Yes, thank
Yes.
you. Thank you. I was looking up the Dimrock line, and it turns out that that was something around Petersburg in 1864 in our
No,
Civil
not
War.
that.
So I was a little off on that one. But after that photo you showed, I immediately recognized it of that villa sitting there by itself and the Würzburg radar. Yeah, that amazing photograph. After the Brits captured that radar and were able to implement countermeasures, what did the Germans do in terms of their own countermeasures?
Well, for radar, there wasn't a vast amount. They they tried to get better at distinguishing, because what came after this was
Hmm.
what came after this was chaff, which was just utterly devastating, but also these things on board that would just blast it. I mean, they had to get better at discriminating the actual planes, and there were ways of doing this. So they were working on things which were immensely clever, which have ended up becoming the sort of things that are used. So you can see within the radar if you're moving.
Hmm.
That's the first thing. So if there's a way to remove things that are stationary electronically, which they tried to work on, then you can get rid of things like the sort of chaff. You can also see the turning of a propeller, and they worked on things like that. But the truth is that come 1943, they were so on the defensive, and there was so much else going on that basically their ingenuity, it wasn't their ingenuity ran out, but by 1944 they were sending these people to the front line, and they were
Yeah, yeah,
losing the people who had the knowledge, and it just ended up that the night fighters, and then the night fighters were having British, actually, I think it was British, I think, rather than Americans with mosquitoes, were going to the same beacons that they circled around, and just hanging around them like sort of sharks, and just shooting them down and locking onto their. But the radar war was so much more than just radar, because you had devices to lock onto the airborne radar, and then you had devices to lock onto the thing that's locking onto the airborne radar, and it
yeah.
became this sort of weird thing. But in terms of Freya, no, that they didn't really get beyond that particular system. They just had to get better at understanding the signals and signal
Okay,
processing.
thanks.
Thanks, Craig. Mark, we'll close out with you if you want to unmute your line and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. Regarding the raid on this radar site that we see here, if I remember correctly, the British didn't load the entire machinery and take it back. They just took particular parts. And I was wondering if
Yeah.
what specific guts of the machine that they took, and why did they take what they did, and why didn't they take anything else?
So the last question I can answer is because they were getting shot at, um, and
Okay, yeah.
they'd some members of the crew were. So this was quite a rough and ready bunch, and there were amazing reports where the guys training them. I think they were trained on Dartmoor in Britain, if I remember, and they said they seem to be really good at breaking and entering and sort of using crowbars to steal things. But they were trained on that, and there was a tension between the radio scientists who were saying, "Look, be careful, use screwdrivers," and the soldiers who just wanted to get the crowbars and get the hell out of there. So they took what they could. I think, if I recall, they took the top section, they took the guts of it, the electronic guts of it, and it was sort of enough. But they didn't have the luxury of time because reinforcements were coming in. And the other thing I didn't say is about a third of the paratroopers had landed completely off target. And they were the ones that were meant to be securing the beach, and they only just arrived in time, having had this sort of amazing diversion. So no, they took what they could, but it was enough. Jones describes sort of 2 days later, sitting down and watching the guy they captured piece it all together. So I don't know where it's kept. I was in the Imperial War Museum, which is our place, and I did see a full. I saw a full Würzburg there, and thought, could that be the one? But I don't think it was, because it wasn't a full one. It didn't have any bullet holes on it. So I don't know where in Britain it is, if it is indeed still in Britain. But yeah, it's a good question. Can I say all of these questions have been very good? They've been among the most informed that I've had. So thank you.
Lastly, you mentioned they captured one guy. Did they capture any others? And I assumed he was the best,
No, he was not the best technical one. So I alluded to this. They captured him. I think they captured one more who wasn't a radio operator. And in the report, it says they captured him, quotes, because he surrendered so vigorously. And I think there's a real look. Again, I'm not judging, but there were definite, by modern standards, war crimes committed here, and I think actually Jones is quite pissed off that they didn't capture someone more competent, and he said to them afterwards, "Look, you could have taken some more, because the guy they got was useless. He could barely operate it, but he was their technical guy, and they could have got more, but I think they executed them."
Ah, really? Oh wow. That's not smart.
So if you look at the picture of the radar in this map, when the guys from the villa, the guy leading the operation stormed the villa at the same time as someone else stormed the radar. When he arrived at the villa, there was an argument, and this is written about in the report, and the quote I remember was something like, he's castigating the guy who did the attack on the radar, calling him a cold-hearted bastard or something like that. So you got to read between the lines, but yeah.
Understood. Thank you.
Tom, there's one or two questions on the sort of technical differences between the Nicobane X system and the Y system. And one question specifically is, was it just a fluke that the Y Garrot was run on the same, I guess, frequency or spectrum as the BBC? And was that just luck, or how big a role did that play?
I'm so sorry I lost you. I don't know if it's at your end or mine. I'm not sort of claiming when you get to the technical stuff, I can't hear. Can you try again?
There are a few questions. I'm trying to sort of create a composite question here. Could you just briefly talk about the technical or the differences between the Nicobane, the X Garrot, and the Y Garrot? And there's one question. Was the Y Garrot, did it use the same spectrum or frequency as the BBC?
Yeah. So the X-Garrot and the Nicobane were sort of similar in that they used cross beams. The X-Garrot was listened to electronically rather than by a human, and you got a needle that went this way or that way. And each had a series of cross beams that sort of told you to get ready, and then told you to drop your bombs, and it did that ahead of the target, having sort of computed your speed. That's making it maybe slightly more sophisticated than it was, but it used a way of working out your speed. The Y-grate was completely different, and it was in fact the one mentioned in the Oslo report, and it was for controlling an individual bomber. And actually, the UK and US used a similar system later on in the war, but it pinged out a radio beam and then listened for its return. And from the distance, from the time it took to return from the plane, they could then tell the plane how far they were from that particular the beacon, and then there was another beam to direct it. So you got your sort of your distance and you got your direction, and you would direct an individual plane. But yeah, that turned out to be the same frequency as the BBC TV transmitter at Alexandra Palace, which was a wonderful coincidence. And it hadn't been transmitting TV since the war started. So they used it to create a sort of feedback mechanism. They decided we're going to be creative on it, a bit like if you've been at a wedding and someone stands in front of the speaker and uses the microphone and it creates this sort of terrible kind of wailing. They did that where they intercepted and sent it slightly off, and it was just enough to get them confused and get them wondering, not trusting. And it effectively meant that Y-grate was, so X-grate was used, Knickerbein was used, Y-grate was basically bust from the beginning. And Jones was really pleased because he used the clever mechanism. For Knickerbein, if they'd been clever, they could have bent the beams and they could have directed the bombers to all sorts of places, but actually they didn't have time, and it was pretty crude. But for Y-grate, they did exactly what he wanted.
Perfect. And the German, the equivalent of Jones on the German side would have been Wendell, who was the engineer or the author of this. And I think the U.S. actually picked him up after the war. So he went on to have a second career helping, helping the Allies. But thank you. That was a great talk, Tom. Thank you very much. Again, the book is The Battle of the Beams, The Secret Science of Radar That Turned the Tide of the Second World War. Highly recommended picking up. It's a fantastic read. Please join us next Saturday at 1 p.m. when historian Paul Thomas Chamberlain will discuss his book, Scorched Earth, A Global History of World War II, which dispatches the myth of World War II as a good war. Instead, he depicts the conflict as it truly was, a massive battle beset by vicious racial atrocities fought between rival empires across huge stretches of Asia and Europe. I suspect I will get a few emails after that talk, but anyway, it should be exciting, or certainly interesting. On that note, Tom, thank you very much for your time today. I know it's late in London, and we hope to have you back, maybe on the Cavity Magnetron at some point. So,
thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the great questions.
Thank you.
Great talk.
Take care, everyone.